You're listening to the Red Eye Hour.
Welcome back, everybody. It's your host, JMeeks, and this is the Red Eye Hour, and we are back for a new Solo Stories Part 3. And this one's going to be a good one, guys. It's actually going to be like a 2-part series. So Part 3 and Part 4 will be connected. And the story that I will be telling this time is called Witches and Warlocks. And if you are a person that's from this area or a townie, you have heard about this place. It's also known as Cedar Creek Cemetery and the Hayes Cemetery. So, on this part, I'm going to explain to you guys the history of it a little bit, and then give you some background, urban myth stories of what people have reported. And then part 4, I'm actually going to tell you actual personal experiences that I had at this cemetery. Alright, so Witches and Warlocks, let's get it. So it's located 6 miles north of Manhattan, Kansas, and it's actually in a county called Pottawatomie County. So some quick history. This area used to be called, and could still be called this, maybe to the locals or by some historians in this area. It is known as the Cedar Creek Valley. So the small amount of information I could find was that the first European settlers that came through Kansas, a couple of the families decided that they would just settle here in this area. They liked it, had fertile ground, it had water resources nearby, like creeks and stuff like that. Obviously, Cedar Creek. It's a creek that runs through that area and by that cemetery. And then later on, the construction of Tuttle Creek Dam. So they decided that it would be a resourceful place and they would settle here. So the family that decided to stay, the majority of them are the Hayes family, like Hays. At Witches and Warlocks, aka Cedar Creek Cemetery, or also known as the Hayes Cemetery, most of the graves in there are from the Hayes family. So as years went by and the Hayes family settled in and lived on the land out there and people started passing away in the family, they decided for this area to be where they were going to bury their loved ones. So it used to be named the Hayes Cemetery, and then later on, because of the location of where they settled, the Cedar Creek Valley and the Cedar Creek actual water that ran through that area, over the years they changed the name to Cedar Creek Cemetery. So you're probably asking, okay, that's interesting. And also, where does the Witches and Warlocks, how's that play a part into it? And I will get to that, but let me tell you some more facts and history first. In the registries, it also says that there's still 2 of the original stone buildings that were built in that time period when the settlers decided to live on that land. 2 of the original stone structures are still being used today, is what it says, but it doesn't specify. So there is an old stone church on Cedar Creek Road on the way to the cemetery. I don't know if that was part of the community, and that's one of the buildings, which is now a historical marker. And then the other one, you know how people do, they'll modernize their house, but one section of it will be old, so they can keep that historical old look. Not too sure, not a lot of information about it. So in the urban myth, they say that there was more than just a couple of the stone buildings that these settlers had built, that there was one that was right outside the perimeter of Cedar Creek Cemetery, or Witches and Warlocks. And in that stone home lived the witch and the warlock. So legend claims that they had an offspring, and it was a hybrid type, half human, half warlock type creature that used to run around the woods in that area. And the urban myth versions I've heard is that these two were related to the Hayes family. They had the Hayes family last name, actually. but they were like outcasted from the family back in the day and outcasted from the farming community that lives in that area. So the story goes that the witch put a hex or a curse on the ground around that area. Supposedly, if you're brave enough, you can find the remnants or the old stone like structure, the ground structure, what it was built on, right outside the cemetery fence there in the wooded area. Supposedly you can find the remains of the old house. So story goes that when the witch and the warlock died, the relatives and other farming families in that Cedar Creek Valley area had the house torn down. Because of the way the witch and the warlock lived and the mysterious things that happened in the area, they just decided to tear it down and they could just forget about it. A couple weird things about witches and warlocks is that it's independently owned, but the county keeps it up, like keeps it mowed and trimmed a little bit. They've also, in the last 20 years, have put up a new fence. It's like flint stone with like wrought iron that goes around, and it does make it look a lot nicer. It used to have a really old, decrepit fence. So it has a nice new fence. It looks fine, makes it look better. They used to have a big red gate, almost like one you'd see like out at a ranch or a farm, that you would open up, one of the big long ones. That is also not there anymore, which I thought was always kind of weird that they had this big red gate. So now they have more of like an arch, and it says Cedar Creek Cemetery, and it kind of looks like a normal entrance to a cemetery. The other thing is there's no signs or like information that tell you like these are the visiting times that you can come to the cemetery, or for instance, Sunrise Cemetery here in Manhattan, at sunrise it opens and at sunset it closes. Some cemeteries have more specific times, right? That's pretty common. This doesn't have any signs. There's no indication that you're not supposed to come at certain times. But through the Potawatomi County Police Department, once the sun sets, Cedar Creek Cemetery is off limits and is no trespassing, and you can be arrested for it. And the police say they can do this because it's private property. Now in my mind, something goes off and says, so it's private property, but the county maintains the grounds. Our tax dollars help maintain the ground, even though it's independently owned. I don't know. I just always thought that was a little fishy to me. Okay, so next, let's get into some actual real stories reported by people and urban myths about witches and warlocks. So as you travel down this dirt road that's only 6 miles off of the main road and there in Raleigh County, which turns into Pot County, it seems a lot longer than 6 miles. It's pretty dark out there. There's a few farmhouses scattered around, but you're out in the country for sure. So when you get there, there's a big circle drive that you can park in. And in the middle of this circle drive is like a huge tree, and it's kind of like split in the middle. So it's very dark out there. That is one of the things I personally noticed, and what is reported on the internet on different websites like Haunted Heartland and different like haunted cemetery websites, things like that, is the same thing. It's so quiet out there, it's almost creepy. And that is something that I personally experienced too and thought was pretty weird. So the next important thing is when you go into the cemetery, in the very middle of the cemetery is another wrought iron gate. And it's about, 3 feet tall, maybe all the way around, in the direct center of the cemetery. And inside it is like 3 to 4 graves. There's the woman and the man, last name both Hayes. the gravesite stones. The grave stones are kind of weird. It has like exactly when she died, like this date, on this day, this year, on this hour, like in this many seconds. I thought that was super bizarre. I never really see that on headstones at all. And then there's the Warlock grave, which is the same as the witch's grave, looks the same, has the same information on it. Then there's supposedly their offspring grave, and that grave is rough looking. It looks like it had like a taller part, but maybe it had been broke off. And it is very common when you're there. People put sage and they put healing stones on that headstone and pennies and things like that. And I understand why they do it. So they put the healing stones on there. Some ward off evil energy. Some absorbs evil energy. The sage is to help cleanse the area, of any evilness or dark mojo. So I get why they do those things. Some people believe in those things and why they're there. Maybe they're just trying to be helpful. The headstones themselves are very old, so they're 17 and 1800s. Also, the placement of some of the stones I think are very odd in that cemetery, especially under this old pine tree. There was like a taller headstone, and then in front of it, and just the way they were positioned, when you looked at it, it looked like there was like a person standing there that would be talking, and then you have the other people that were standing there listening to them. That's what you thought in your mind when you looked at the placement of these headstones. Don't know why it's like that. It's really weird. Another report, and this is more personal for me, but other people have agreed with me, the ground in that cemetery is like oddly too soft. Like when you walk, it's super squishy everywhere. And to me personally, like that's freaky. Like I can't be walking through a cemetery that has like mushy ground, because I feel like I'm gonna like sink into it. You know what I mean? That would be terrifying. So in all the internet blogs and things that people's posted, and Haunted America books and Haunted Cemetery books and all these different resources that I've read, one of the things that people report the most is that when you're in the cemetery, especially at night, you get this uneasy feeling and this sense that you're being watched. And I can agree with that. My two experiences there was the same thing. It just felt like multiple people were watching you, but they were like outside of the fence of the cemetery, like just enough in the woods where you can't see them, but they can see you. And like I said in the beginning, it's so dark out there, and that's something I'm going to speak about also. So the big urban myth is, if you're out there on a full moon night, there have been reports from people that they have seen one red eye, or there's reports that they have seen a pair of red eyes looking at them from the forest when they're inside the cemetery. On the internet, people have posted pictures of orbs from the cemetery. They've also posted pictures of orbs that have faces in them. That was pretty weird. Lots of reports where it sounds like people are walking around outside the fence of the cemetery or in the cemetery, like towards the back. That's something that's been reported a lot. Apparitions, thinking they see something out of the side of their eye and their peripheral vision. One of the big ones, and I don't know about this one. Someone was saying when an old urban myth, they were trying to leave after they were freaked out and they were in their car, and as they're pulling out of that weird circle drive, they see the apparition of a like horse and carriage, like coming out of the woods to the left, crossing the dirt road, and then going to the side of the road where the cemetery is into the woods, and then just fading away and dissipating, and you don't see it anymore. So some other reports of witches and warlocks and things that happen out there, that's all a part of the urban myth. People have reported the flickering of headlights. They've also reported cars having trouble starting, like when they're wanting to leave and get out of there, that they have either their cars won't start at all, or they have a really hard time starting. But then eventually they do, but at first they have issues. There's been reports of like disembodied voices on digital recorders when they're doing like EVP sessions and stuff like that, like ghost hunters. Amateur ghost hunters have reported that they've heard disembodied voices on devices they were using. So, people I've personally talked to and stories from the urban myth in the 80s and the late 80s, like teenagers would go out there and they would party and they would like trash the cemetery and leave beer cans laying around, and they would vandalize the graves. People would also bring Ouija boards out to witches and warlocks, and they would try to summon spirits, and they'd especially do this like on Halloween or on the spring and fall equinox. Why I mentioned that last part is because I think because people have done that and vandalized the graves and disrespected the cemetery itself, I think that is why there's paranormal activity that happens at the cemetery. I think the spirits are just not at rest. They've been disturbed and they've been disrespected. And so I think anybody that shows up there, especially at night, they don't like it. And that's just my personal take on it because of the way what people did to the cemetery. So earlier when I was talking about the silence out there at Witches and Warlocks, how it can get so quiet that it's creepy. Another thing too, and I've experienced this, is that even though like the moon will be out, it'll be a clear night and you can see fairly well with the moonlight, but you still have flashlights, it'll become dark. It's like you're watching it happen, like this dark just fading in. And even though your flashlights will still work, you're definitely not seeing not even half the distance you were before it got dark. Like you can basically see right in front of you and that's it. I've been sitting in the car when it's happened and it just got darker and darker and darker, and I'm sitting in the car with a young lady and like we can barely see each other. That's how dark it was. And that happening, that was pretty freaky because it was a clear night. The moon was out, like I said, and you could still see the moon, but there was like this blanket of darkness that came over. And other people have reported this happening as well, and that's pretty strange. All right, so we're getting to the end of like the history and the urban myth tales that are out there about witches and warlocks. I'll talk about a couple more things just for fun. People have reported their phones acting up, flashlights misbehaving and not working correctly. Also, car radios not being able to tune in any radio stations or blinking in and out and not working properly. Also, police have reported like police radios pick up a lot of interference out there, and they will have trouble trying to communicate back to base or with other police officers. That's pretty weird. There's also reports of near car crashes, not actual car crashes where anybody died, but there's reports of near car crashes. And there's also been reports that people that have gone there have become like super ill and were hospitalized and became very sick, and even to the point where they thought they might pass away, and just refused, to never step foot back in that place ever again. So that's some history and reports of stories over the years. So part 4, I will be telling 2 stories of actual personal experiences I've had at Witches and Warlocks. One's from high school, and that's about the mid-90s. And the other one is in college on Halloween, and that's around the year 2000, 2001. So I'm really excited to tell you guys those stories. Thanks for tuning in tonight to the Red Eye Hour. I really appreciate it. Thanks for checking out the other solo stories, and we will talk to you guys soon. Goodbye.
Thanks for flying with the Red Eye Hour.